Just share my screen. So welcome back, everyone, to the second session of this calibrated land model intercomparison project, CalMIP, Planning and Development Workshop. Let me just get this going. And okay, I'm going to just move all the little videos of everyone. So anyone on the planning committee, if please stop me and call out if people have questions or something like that, and I'm not seeing that. Okay. Can everyone see the slides okay? Yeah, some nods. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay. Okay, yeah, so welcome back to this second session of planning basically for the first stage of the CalMIP. Here we go, some thoughts and some overall general messages that we collated, if you like, as a planning committee from the first session, was that a couple of things. So one would be, we presented a plan of what the first phase could look like with some things that we'd fairly well decided on, even if those things are ultimately things that individual modeling groups will decide on themselves. And then there were things that were still undecided. And so there was a couple of requests to put that all into an actual draft paper, a draft protocol. And we have started doing that, and we're going to then share that with you after this session. So you have time for the next couple of weeks to read it and provide feedback for the final session. But we're not going to talk too much about specifics of that first phase protocol today, because the other thing that we really felt from the first session was that people needed to see a bit more of a plan or a vision of what subsequent phases or stages of CalMIP might look like, so that then you could then envisage, what might fit in the first phase and then what could come later. So we're actually going to use this session today to brainstorm or to lay out a potential plan on our side of what subsequent stages could look like, as well as what we envisage for this first phase. So that's the near term. Then the long-term vision is obviously much more vague, but we have sort of ideas, possible different routes that this could take, and we'll lay that all out for you. And then we're going to have a breakout session to discuss all of that. So both the near-term plan and not the specifics, as I mentioned, of that plan, but just the outline of what would be done in that first phase, and then how future stages of CalMIP could look like. And it's really open, right? We have ideas, but we want this to be a community-driven thing. And if people also want to take this off in their own direction, but with all the community, that's great as far as we're concerned. So it's really not us. It's really not us wanting to just have this path that we're taking and we're just telling you what we think. We want it to be a community-led and driven thing. So there was also in the first session a fair bit of discussion on additional experiments beyond what we'd proposed, which makes sense because what we had proposed is really what many of you have done already, possibly a long time ago. But as I'll explain in just a minute, we still think that keeping it fairly simple in this first phase is a good idea for reasons I'll mention. So then, but there's room maybe to add some additional experiments in this phase one, or maybe leave those for later stages. So that's going to be part of the discussion today. So yeah, you'll see that compared to the original agenda that we laid out in the first session, this second session looks a bit different. We'll just give you our sort of future vision of CalMIP, but it's, again, really open, right? It's just possibilities, what it could look like. And then we'll have breakout discussions on that and then get everyone's feedback from that. And based on that, it might just change, what we're going to plan to do for this first stage. Then in that third session, in a couple of weeks, sorry, my Down here is when we'll really decide on the specifics for this first phase, right? So we'll have the outline of the first phase set, and then specific decisions about forcing data, etc., will be decided upon. And that will also be building on feedback that hopefully you'll provide on the draft protocol in the intervening 2 weeks. That's our plan. Okay, so the near-term vision for CalMIP. So this is what we basically laid out last week. This phase 1 would be site-based optimizations using a selection of sites that yet to be determined, using flux tower data, with models that can or will run global simulations with those optimized parameters. So the idea is that, if you have multiple sites, you optimize in a way, whatever way that is, that you get a set of parameters that you can use for a global scale simulation. Whether we require everyone to do that global scale simulation at this point is to be decided. We're all leaning towards that on the planning committee because a lot of the real sort of big interesting questions that we're asking of these global scale models are obviously global. And the plan for a paper would be that we'd describe that improvement across models, how, across models, what's the range of reduction in uncertainties, what's the reduction in the spread across models for key variables at regional to global scale. And again, that, regional to global scale part really means that we need to run global scale simulations. So that would be led by my group and the planning committee, but with anyone involved who wants to be part of, deciding the shape that paper takes. Co-authorship would be for anyone that had performed experiments or had any intellectual input into the first phase of experiments and the policy for that, as well as an open data policy that i.e. that all the outputs from our experiments would be available for people, will be laid out in the draft protocol. We've already got a section for that. So everyone would know ahead of time what they were getting into and what they were going to get out of it, right? And as you'll see in a minute, I've put papers here because you can imagine that we decide actually there's multiple papers from even these simple experiments, and then we just need to decide as a community who's going to lead that. I think part of what we can discuss today is what kind of questions we might ask in the paper or papers that come from the first phase. But I also imagine that could evolve over time, and we could keep meeting as a group for the people that are participating to sort of narrow down and shape the analyses that come out of these experiments. Okay. So with that in mind, just some ideas, right, of potential questions. So I just mentioned some of these, but how does the reduction in model data misfit, so the posterior minus the prior, vary across models? So are all models getting a big reduction in model data misfit or not? Of course, the next question is why, and we're not necessarily going to try and dig into that because that would probably require some more additional experiments, but I'll put a pin in that and talk about that again later. To what extent does parameter calibration reduce the spread across models for certain variables? How do all these questions, how do the answers to these questions differ for different variables? So carbon fluxes, carbon stocks, ET, soil moisture, even if we're only optimizing with, say, carbon fluxes and evapotranspiration. Or if we're looking, at site scale versus at global scale. And then, we might decide to just have regional specific or variable specific questions that, we can bring together as a community because we all know different things, right? And we're all aware of different things. So someone in the planning committee asked me to put together some potential figures. So I've sketched this out. This on the left here is a vision of comparing across models, the prior and the posterior mean global carbon sink. So this is normally actually shown as negative. But the idea, the thinking, the hypothesis is that most models would simulate too weak a sink in the prior model and very variable. And then you might expect that when you calibrate across all models, you get a much better or much reduced spread across models, and it's a much greater sink. So that's just a question I'm familiar with in my work. I think I couldn't find it in my notes, but I think someone was talking about how there's a known ET bias in the models in the eastern US. So I sketched this out. I really don't know if this is how it looks in model simulations, but so let's just say there's a known bias in a certain region, right? And what does that look like in all the prior models? And do you find in the posterior models that that bias is reduced or not? Again, the vision here that on our side is that we wouldn't be able to dig into why necessarily, as everyone is coming to this with their own system and methods are going to vary, and the way, spin up is done is going to vary, and so many things are going to vary, that our vision is to document all of that and try to point to things that might be causing, for example, why a model doesn't get a reduction in bias versus one that does get a reduction in bias. But we won't be able to fully diagnose that beyond discussing it without additional experiments, okay? Now, again, I think to some people this might seem simple because it's work that we've been doing for a long time. But I guess, the thinking behind this is, let's say, right, that when CMIP 7 comes around, we realize everyone's calibrated their model, right? But they've also, which is, I don't think is going to happen, I should say. But let's say they've done that, and then they've also added, permafrost, and they've also done this to improve their biases. And then, there's a real change in the model spread for certain variables, and we have no idea how much parameter calibration is a part of that. So with that in mind, this kind of first paper is just really to get a sense of just how much parameter calibration can affect this kind of thing, this kind of questions that we're asking, across models. Okay, so if that's the idea for the first phase, right, that's up here now. That would be to go over 25 to 26. And then from then on, there's a range of the sort of longer term phases, the longer term vision. There's a whole range of ideas. Nothing is set, or it's really, up to us all as a community to decide. So things that have come up from the first discussions, I've put here in potential phase twos. But as I'll note, there's possibilities, I think, to have these as part of the first phase, but maybe as sort of mini MIPs within the bigger MIP. So I think that's one thing to discuss today. Do we leave some of these things to a later stage? Or do we decide, well, while we're already running this first stage, we know we can do something else beyond that, and we'll do that now and see how many other groups are doing that. And then that can be a kind of mini MIP within the first phase. So that's a question for everybody. But possible things that came up. So I've already mentioned additional experiments to test the parameter calibration setup, with the idea that we want to really learn more of this why question. Why, if we do the parameter calibration in this way versus a different way, do we get a different result? And if we can compare that with other models that are doing those same tests, do they also see a similar result? And from that, can we really learn how to better do parameter calibration, better set up that parameter calibration? With that in mind, in the draft protocol, I've already put a table of potential additional experiments. So one example is to optimize with atmospheric CO2 data. So that's obviously not a site-based optimization. And then there's a column where you can sign up to that kind of experiment if you wanted to do it in the first phase. Also, you can add your own ideas for additional experiments. The goal there is to sort of gather information on what kinds of experiments people would want to do, and then see whether there's enough people in this first phase to maybe add that on as a bit of a mini MIP within CalMIP, or to just keep those ideas in mind for potential second phase. Okay. This one is kind of maybe part of this. Optimize, there's a lot of chatter about, folks not wanting to just optimize with flux data, but also with, say, carbon stocks or soil moisture in hydrology. And so again, I mean, you could consider that part of this, like an additional set of experiments where you're running other things that maybe not every group is doing. Other things that have come up that are relatively easy, I'd say, in the near term. So this sort of phase 2 is sort of relatively easy in the after phase 1, or backing up to phase 1, if you like. That's the kind of category of things that have gone into phase 2. So one thing would be, in this phase 1, we're not going to be having any future simulations, but that could be part of a phase 2, is that we get a set of forcing data to run all the models offline, up to, say, 2100 with our optimized parameters, and see what the impact is, on those things like whether the land is going to stay a carbon sink or not, up to, say, 2100. So that's another possibility. And the vision obviously would be that each of these would involve at least one paper, but you can imagine this could easily result in multiple papers with other people as lead authors, to be decided within the community, depending on, who is driving that effort, I'd say. But the co-author policy would remain the same. People who'd submitted experiments, intellectual input, etc., helped with writing, would be part of the co-author team. I've put in blue down here that, we are wanting an open data policy. So all our model outputs, prior and posterior calibration, would be documented in a public available repository to be decided upon. But that would mean that anyone could take those outputs and do their own set of analyses, and we just have to develop the policy within the draft protocol for phase 1 for what the co-authorship or collaboration or acknowledgement policy is for that. Okay, so keep that in mind too when we're discussing. Okay, so move this up here. That's just the same. And I didn't mention, the idea would be that this would follow on. Everything is always delayed compared to the timeline. So, but that would be in the sort of year or two after the first phase, or 3. And then from then on, what's in phase 3 here is really, I'd say the category of things here is things that no one, I don't think, could easily do that now. It's something that it's things that we're working towards as a community, and also initiatives or things that are already happening that we might want to merge CalMIP into. Okay, so some examples are, it was discussion about this last time, but eventually we want to get to doing coupled model optimizations. So we're not just doing optimizations of parameters with offline models, but in the full running of the Earth system model. So that could be a component of a later phase of CalMIP. But other later phases could be that we contribute to the CalMIP runs at this sort of more global scale, offline or coupled, that are then part of other things that are going on. Like an example here is the global carbon budget each year that uses the trendy set of models. And the idea would be that, we talked to Stephen Sitch about having a calibrated set of models informing that global carbon budget. I'm less familiar with other things, maybe in hydrology and things like that, but yeah, I'm sure there's loads of other things where this could fit into. And then an obvious one, of course, is that maybe, we're for sure too late for for CMIP 7, would we want to try and have CalMIP running at global scale as a MIP within CMIP 8, for example? Is that too soon? Do we want that? Do we, and what are the other kinds of really global international initiatives that are going on that we might eventually want CalMIP to grow to be a part of? Again, this would be, obviously the goal in all of this would be to get papers out. And our vision is that this would be, again, community driven and led by people who are interested and want to be involved in any of those different aspects. So it's kind of a choose your own pathway kind of thing beyond the first phase, that really could go in multiple directions. And it could also be that, there's multiple different teams within this bigger CalMIP effort that are leading different parts of this according to their interests and, what they want to see happen. I hope that's fairly clear, but yeah, that's the sort of vision. Okay, so now we're going to go to breakout groups to discuss all of that and get your feedback on it. Any questions that you have, ask us. And we're going to do that for 40 minutes, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So